It was the kind of overcast afternoon that makes everything feel a little heavier. I was halfway through my shift, wiping grease from my hands and staring at the next dispatch on my phone. A battery change. Simple enough. The location was a quiet, residential cul-de-sac, about 15 minutes from where I was parked. I loaded up the replacement and took off, not expecting anything beyond another routine job. I'd done hundreds of these jump starts, battery swaps, tire changes. Most folks barely looked up from their phones. This would be just another task. Checked off before I went home to microwave leftovers and scrolled mindlessly until I fell asleep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But when I pulled up to the address, I noticed something. It was too quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind of silence that sits in the corners of a place and waits. The house itself was well kept. Small front yard, white shutters. A porch swing that looked like it hadn't moved in a while. The car, a silver sedan, sat at a slight angle in the driveway, who'd already popped. And there she was, mid-50s, maybe standing near the porch with a phone in her hand, not looking at it. She was staring straight at the ground like it had just told her something she didn't want to hear. I parked behind the car and got out, toolbox in hand. She turned quickly when she heard me approach. I saw her try to adjust her expression. It's one of those split-second transformations where someone pastes on a polite smile just to keep from unraveling. I gave her a small wave, the kind I always do, half professional, half human. She said her battery had died unexpectedly that morning. She'd been planning to go grocery shopping, but the engine didn't even try to turn over. I nodded, crouched down, started working. She hovered nearby, clearly unsure whether to make conversation or give me space. I didn't mind. Most people either disappeared or stood awkwardly until I was done. But her energy was different. She wasn't impatient or annoyed or even grateful in that overly thankful way some clients get. She was just present, like she had nowhere else to be. As I unhooked the old battery and set it aside, she suddenly asked, "Is this your full-time job?" I told her it was part-time, just enough hours to stay busy. She nodded slowly, like she was storing that information away for later. Then she said nothing for a while, just watched me work with a far-off look in her eyes. Normally I don't pay much attention to the people I help, but there was something in her voice, in the way she lingered near the car, even though I didn't need her there. It made me wonder, if the dead battery wasn't the only thing that had failed that day. I secured the new battery in place, tightened everything down, and closed the hood. She startled slightly when it slammed shut, like she'd been somewhere else in her head and had just been yanked back to reality. I told her to go ahead and start the engine. It turned over without hesitation, humming steadily beneath us. Glanced at her, expecting a quick thanks and maybe a signature on the form I carried, but she didn't move toward the driver's seat. Instead, she stepped a little closer to me and asked, very softly, "Do you mind just staying for a moment?" Blinked. That was new. There was something raw about the way she said it. Not flirtatious, not desperate, just incredibly tired. I checked my watch. I was ahead of schedule, and honestly, I didn't feel like sitting in traffic just yet. I nodded and leaned against the side of her car while she looked down at her hands like she was trying to work up the courage to explain herself. She didn't, not yet. Instead, we stood there, two strangers with a running engine between us, and let the silence settle back in. That was the first time I met her. And if I'd known how much that moment would change me, if I'd known what she'd tell me a few days later, I would. If you paid more attention to the way her voice cracked when she said goodbye as I left her driveway that afternoon, because sometimes the people who ask you to stay aren't looking for help with a car. They're looking for proof that someone still will. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not in the way people think about someone they're attracted to, but more like how you replay a song after hearing just a few haunting chords. There was a weight behind her words, behind her silences even, that tugged at something in me I usually kept buried. I'd seen a lot of people in this line of work, angry people, rushed people, grateful people. But I rarely saw someone who Looked like they were barely holding on. That woman did. I didn't even know her name. Still, I found myself hoping I'd get another call from her address. Not because I wanted anything from her, but because I wanted to give her something, maybe. A little ease, maybe just someone standing still long enough to notice her. It wasn't long before I got what I didn't know I was waiting for. 3 days later, a ticket popped up on my queue and my stomach flipped before my eyes confirmed it. Same street, same house, same sedan. Engine won't start, the note. Said I checked the previous record, new battery had been working fine. Something didn't add up, but I accepted the call without hesitation. As I pulled up the driveway again, everything looked the same. The car hadn't moved, but this time she wasn't outside. I knocked gently on the door, and after a few seconds, she opened it with the same fragile composure she had before. Smile tucked in place, eyes quietly scanning mine, like she was unsure whether I'd actually come. She stepped aside and told me the engine wouldn't turn over again. Her voice was a little more tired, her tone slower, like she'd used up most of her energy just making the call. I nodded, offering a calm assurance I didn't totally feel. I checked the car while she stood a few feet back, arms crossed but not defensive, more like someone bracing themselves against something that had nothing to do with the weather. The battery was fine, terminals were clean, connections secure. I turned the key. The car hesitated, coughed, and then roared to life. No mechanical issue, no drain, nothing wrong at all. I looked back at her and saw her expression shift just slightly, not to surprise or confusion, but something closer to embarrassment. Like she'd been caught lying even though she hadn't said anything false. I stepped away from the wheel and quietly closed the door. She didn't say a word as I stood in front of her, waiting for her to speak. Then, in a small voice barely louder than the breeze, she said she hadn't driven the car at all since I fixed it. She admitted she hadn't really planned to leave the house. She just wanted a reason to see someone again. Her daughter had moved away last year. Her husband had passed almost 2 years before that. Most days she didn't speak to anyone, not even a neighbor. The grocery list on her counter had the same 5 things she kept meaning to buy, but never quite worked up the strength to leave for. I listened, unsure what to say. I wasn't trained for this part, no manual for quiet grief, or the kinds of loneliness that trick people into thinking their appliances are broken, just so they can talk to someone. But I didn't interrupt her. I let her speak. Her words weren't dramatic, just honest. She said some days felt endless, others felt invisible. She'd start her morning thinking she'd clean or call someone or bake something like she used to. But then by late afternoon, she'd find herself sitting in the same chair, with nothing to show for the hours but silence. Her railing, letting her finish at her own pace. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for pity. She just told the truth, like it was overdue and exhausting to hold inside. When she stopped, she apologized not for the fake car issue, but for pulling me into her mess. I shook my head and told her it wasn't a mess. It was human. She smiled at that. A real one this time. Faint but present. I offered to take a quick look under the hood anyway, just to be sure. She laughed lightly and said, "Sure, humor me." As I pretended to inspect the engine again, I realized I didn't want to leave just yet. I asked her if she had tea. She looked surprised, then nodded and motioned toward the porch. She brought out 2 mismatched mugs, one with a chip in the handle, and we sat there as the afternoon began to mellow. She told me her name was Mara. She used to be a teacher, loved poetry, traveled once to the Scottish Highlands just to see a ruin she'd read about in a book. Her late husband had been a mechanic, she said with a small grin, which made her calling for battery help all the more ironic. She admitted she hadn't opened up to anyone like this in over a year. I told her she didn't have to explain. I didn't mind sitting there. In fact, I needed it more than I realized. Because while Mara had been quiet and alone, I'd been loud and surrounded, but equally disconnected. My life was filled with shallow interactions, brief instructions, fast fixes, receipts, and farewells. But nobody asked me how I was. Not really, and I didn't ask them either. Until now. That visit ended after another hour. I told her the car was good to go, even though we both knew that wasn't why I came back. She thanked me again, then paused as I turned toward my truck. That's when she said it. Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked around the edges. Please don't go. I can't handle another goodbye. I stopped in my tracks, not because I didn't know what to say, but because no one had ever said that to me, not like that. I turned back and saw her eyes locked on mine, not pleading, just open, honest. I nodded slowly and told her I'd be back again. Not for the car, just to talk. And she smiled with something that looked like relief and grief tangled together. That was the second time I met her. It was the first time I realized that sometimes being needed doesn't mean fixing what's broken, it means being willing to show up. Even when nothing needs repair. The third time I saw Mara wasn't because of a car issue. I went on my own. No ticket, no work order, no excuse. I finished my shift early that Friday and drove by her neighborhood without really planning to. As I passed her house, I caught sight of her through the front window, sitting at her dining table, with her chin resting on one hand, staring at a half-filled glass of water. I didn't even knock. I just parked, stepped out, and called her name softly from the edge of the porch. She looked up, startled at first, then opened the door with that same cautious smile that had greeted me the first time. Only now it felt less like a mask and more like recognition. I told her I had a break in my schedule and figured I'd check in. She laughed and said she'd just brewed coffee. We sat on her back patio this time, overlooking a narrow strip of grass and a small, overgrown flower bed. The sunlight filtered through a tangle of tree branches above us, and the wind was just strong enough to move the hanging wind chimes beside her kitchen window. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt earned. She told me more. Stories that day, about her daughter, who'd moved to London for work and barely called anymore. About how she used to host garden parties in this very backyard, how the neighbors would bring over folding chairs and mismatched Tupperware dishes. About how silence used to be a luxury she prayed for when her life was full of noise, and now it felt like a punishment for asking. I listened, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Her voice carried that same soft authority teachers have, but beneath it was an almost childlike need for connection. She didn't want to impress me or entertain me. She just wanted to be seen. I realized I was doing less talking and more feeling in those moments. I watched how she stirred her coffee twice before taking a sip, how she tucked a stray hair behind her ear without thinking, how her eyes flicked toward the horizon whenever she mentioned her late husband. There was a rhythm to her grief, a quiet pattern woven into her habits. She wasn't drowning in it, just coexisting with it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that afternoon, she invited me inside to see something. I followed her to the hallway just off the kitchen, where a series of framed photos lined the wall. Some were black and white, others faded from sun exposure. In one, she stood laughing with a man who looked like he belonged in an old movie's licked-back hair. Crisp collar, eyes locked on her like she was the only thing in the frame that mattered. She touched the corner of that photo with her fingertips as she spoke. She said his name was Robert. They'd been married 31 years. He died of a heart attack while repairing the back fence 2 summers ago. She found him lying in the grass, hand still holding a pair of pliers. There was no goodbye, it's just silence. She said the hardest part wasn't the grief, it was the stillness that came after. The part where you keep expecting the front door to open, the kettle to whistle, the floorboards to creak with familiar steps. But none of that happens. Instead, you sit in a chair meant for 2 and relearn how to live with half a shadow. I didn't know what to say. Anything I could have said would have sounded like a Hallmark card or a lie. So I stood beside her in silence, staring at that photograph, until she finally exhaled and said she was glad I came. Before I left, she pressed a small folded paper into my hand. On it, she had written a poem. Not one she found online, but one she wrote herself. I read it when I got back to my truck. It was short, but heavy. If I water the flowers, they bloom. If I speak to the silence, it grows. But if I ask the wind to stay, it never answers, only goes. I sat with that. For a long while before I started the engine, there was something in those words that echoed louder than anything she'd said aloud. The next few days passed without seeing her, but I kept checking my phone, half expecting another fake ticket to pop up. It didn't. I started wondering if maybe I'd pushed too much, stayed too long, blurred lines that weren't meant to be crossed. But on the fourth day, just as I was finishing a roadside tire change on the edge of town, my phone buzzed with a message. It wasn't from the dispatch system. It was from Mara. Just 3 words. Coffee this week? I stared at that message. Longer than I should have, rereading it like it might change on the 3rd or 4th pass. And then I smiled. Really smiled for the first time in weeks. Because those 3 words didn't ask for help. They asked for time, company, willingness. And I knew in that moment that I'd say yes not, out of duty or obligation. But because I wanted to sit across from her again, wanted to hear more. Of her strange little poems and quiet observations, wanted to learn the rhythms of her silence the way you learn the verses of a song you didn't expect to love. I didn't know what any of it meant or where it was headed, but I knew it was real, and sometimes that's enough. She chose Thursday. I showed up a little past 2 in the afternoon, the same time the shadows had just begun stretching across her porch. The sun caught in the corners of her windows, painting streaks of warmth across the furniture inside. She greeted me with the kind of smile people give when they've been waiting all day for something but aren't sure how to show it. The front door was already open, her hair pinned loosely, sleeves rolled up, and the scent of cinnamon hung in the air like a quiet invitation. On the dining table sat 2 mismatched mugs and a plate of shortbread cookies that looked handmade and slightly uneven. She said she tried baking again for the first time in a year. I told her they smelled like December. She smiled and told me. December used to be her favorite month, before it stopped being about lights and started being about memories. We didn't sit at the table this time. She led me to the small den in the back of the house, a room filled with soft lighting, a faded couch, and a stack of books that had clearly been thumbed through countless times. The fireplace hadn't been used, but the arrangement of candles inside it suggested she was trying to keep the glow alive somehow, even if the warmth was artificial. I sank into the couch and let the stillness settle in. It wasn't the heavy stillness of the first day I met her. It was lighter now, like 2 people deciding to share a quiet without having to fill it. She asked me questions that went deeper than the weather or work. She wanted to know what I was like as a kid. I told her about my time in foster care, how I bounced around until I stopped trying to unpack anything more than essentials. I told her I had a brother once, not by blood, but by circumstance, and how we lost touch after he aged out of the system. I told her I'd never really had a home with photo frames lining the walls or birthday cards taped to the fridge. Listened like it mattered. Like she was building a map of me in her mind, careful not to miss any of the places I'd tucked away. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. She'd tried to foster once, years ago. She and her husband, they'd been approved, prepped, and even matched with a girl who was 10 at the time. But the girl never arrived. Her case changed last minute. Mara still remembered her name, though. Emma said she thought about her sometimes. Wondered where she ended up. There was a strange ache in her voice, the kind people carry when they almost gave something love and never got the chance to. I didn't say anything for a while after that. I just let the meaning hang in the space between us, like unfinished music. At some point, the conversation drifted into silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was reflective. Mara leaned back in her armchair, 1 foot tucked beneath her, cradling her mug with both hands like it was anchoring her to the moment.
Outside the light had shifted.
Shadows danced against the walls as the trees moved in. The breeze. I could hear the distant chirp of birds and the occasional creak of wood settling. It felt timeless, like we were paused between chapters of lives neither of us had finished writing. And then she said something that stayed with me. She said, I don't want to be a woman someone visits because they feel sorry for her. I want to be someone who matters because they chose to. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even a request. It was a quiet declaration of worth, spoken not to be validated, but to remind herself she still existed beyond grief. I told her she didn't have to prove anything to me. That her presence, her stories, her honesty meant more than anything performative ever could. And in that moment, I think she believed me. Not just heard me, but let the words sink into the places inside her that had gone untouched for too long. Before I left, we stood by the door for a while. Neither of us moved to open it. It felt like we were stretching the end of a chapter as far as we could before the page turned. She reached for the cookie plate, offered me one for the road, and then, with a small laugh, asked if it was strange that a part of her looked forward to Thursdays now. I told her it wasn't strange at all. In fact, it made perfect sense. We both needed something to look forward to, something consistent, human, and simple. As I stepped back onto the porch, I caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Beside the door, she looked taller somehow, less folded in on herself. And I wondered if that's what healing sometimes looked like. Not loud or dramatic, but subtle, like a curtain lifting to let in just a little more light. I didn't know where all this was headed. I wasn't trying to save her, and she wasn't, trying to fill some missing piece in me. We were just two people who'd been strangers once, finding comfort in the spaces between what we'd lost. And for now, that was enough. The next few visits blurred into a rhythm neither of us had expected to fall into. What started as a battery call became coffee, then quiet porch afternoons. Then walking side by side along the edge of her garden as she pointed out flowers she used to plant every spring. We never labeled what this was. It wasn't a friendship in the traditional sense, nor a romance in any hurried way. It was something gentler, something we both stepped into slowly, like slipping into the shallows of a lake and waiting for the water to accept us. She shared more in pieces, never all. At once, stories about the way her husband used to hum while fixing things. How she hated the silence of the house at night. How she still caught herself setting the table for two before correcting the mistake. And I shared too, not because I felt obligated, but because there was a softness in her presence that made me want to offer something in return. I told her about my first car, how it broke down the same day I graduated high school, and how I had to walk home in my gown and muddy shoes. Told her how I once wrote poetry as a kid, only to stop when someone laughed at me in 7th grade. Her response wasn't pity, she just nodded. Told me that poems have a way of finding their authors again if they're meant to be written. One afternoon, while the wind pulled softly at the wind chimes and the sky threatened a lazy rain, she asked me if I ever thought about what it meant to truly show up for someone. Not just to be there in emergencies or holidays, but really show up in the quiet, on the slow days, when nothing dramatic demands your presence. I sat with the question for a while, thought about the jobs I'd done, the people I'd met. Briefly, the thousands of passing faces that had thanked me and then disappeared forever. I realized I'd spent most of my adult life coming and going, never being asked to stay. And now here I was, still showing up on her porch weeks after that first call. Not because something was broken, but because something between us felt worth maintaining. I told her that maybe showing up was just another way of saying, I see. You and you matter. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned into her chair and closed her eyes like the words had. Soothed something she didn't know was aching. The following week, she surprised me with a small notebook. It had a navy blue cover and a soft leather binding. Inside were blank pages, but on the first one, she had written a simple sentence in careful handwriting. You said you used to write. Maybe it's time to start again. I didn't know how to react at first. The gift was small, but the meaning behind it landed heavy in my chest. No one had ever encouraged me like that, not in a personal way. She wasn't asking for anything. She just wanted me to have space to reflect, to create, to return to something I had abandoned. That night I sat in my truck for nearly an hour before going inside, thumbing through those empty pages and wondering what words I could possibly give back that would be worthy of her kindness. I didn't write anything that night, but I took the notebook inside and placed it beside my keys, where I'd see it every morning. Another Thursday came, and with it, something different in the air. Mara greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved a little slower, her voice quieter than usual. I asked if everything was okay, and she said she was just tired. We sat in the living room, and for a while, neither of us spoke. There was a heaviness that neither of us addressed. Then, after what felt like a long pause, she told me that the anniversary of her husband's passing was in 2 days. It would be the second one since he died. The first had been a blur of casseroles, awkward phone calls, and distant relatives who didn't know what to say. This one, she said, felt heavier because the world had moved on. No one marked the date but her. She said she kept thinking about how final it had all been, how one morning she had a partner, and by afternoon she had a memory. I didn't know how to comfort her, but I didn't leave either. I sat with her in the dim light of that room and held the silence with her until it didn't feel like silence anymore, just presence. As I left that day, she followed me to the door and hesitated before opening it. She looked up at me with a small, uncertain expression, then asked if I would come back in 2 days. Not to fix anything, not for coffee, just to be. There I nodded without hesitation. She didn't need to explain. I understood more than she knew. Some days the hardest part isn't grief. It's enduring it without a witness, without someone to sit beside you while you remember. I promised I would be there, and for the first time since I met her, she reached out and touched my arm gently. Before saying goodbye, it was such a small gesture, but in it was everything unsettled, the vulnerability, all the gratitude, all the quiet need wrapped in a single, trembling touch. I walked away that day carrying a strange warmth in my chest, something fragile and rare, and I knew then that this wasn't just about company anymore. It was about showing up, again and again, not because it was expected, but because it mattered. The morning of the anniversary came with a pale, overcast sky and the kind of stillness that made everything feel suspended in time. I arrived a little earlier than usual, not wanting her to spend too much of the day alone. The house looked the same from the outside, but something about it felt different, like it was holding its breath. She opened the door before I could even knock, as if she'd been waiting behind it. Her eyes were tired but not puffy. She hadn't cried yet. Or maybe she had, and the tears had dried hours ago. She wore a simple gray sweater and held a folded shawl in her hands like it gave her something to focus on. I stepped inside without speaking. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was shared. A mutual understanding that words today wouldn't do the heavy lifting. She led me to the den again, and we sat, this time even quieter than before. The photos on the wall caught the soft light filtering through the blinds, and for a moment, the house felt like it was listening along with us. She finally spoke after several minutes had passed. She said she'd woken up at 4:13 a.m., the exact time the paramedics had declared him gone. She didn't try to go back to sleep after that. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the spot where he used to sit with his coffee. The same table where he'd read the news and mumbled under his breath at things he couldn't control. She said she almost made 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then stopped herself.
Ow.
Her voice didn't shake as she talked. But it wasn't steady either. It was the kind of voice that came from deep inside, a place that had been waiting 12 months for someone to sit across from her and simply listen. She didn't tell me how much she missed him. She didn't have to. It was in the way her hands stayed folded in her lap, in the way her gaze drifted not toward me, but toward the spaces he used to fill. I stayed silent, nodding occasionally, letting her pour out whatever had been building like floodwaters behind her eyes. Eventually, she stood and walked over to a wooden cabinet near the fireplace. From the top shelf, she pulled down a small, carefully sealed box wrapped in a linen cloth. She brought it over and set it between us. She said she hadn't opened it since the funeral. Inside were letters, dozens of them, one written by her husband during their 31 years together. Some were birthday cards. Others were scribbled notes from quiet days. Few were full letters written during a business trip he took. In the early years of their marriage, she told me she used to reread them often in the first few months after he passed. But one day it became too painful, so she packed them away. But today, on this day, she wanted to read one out loud. Not for closure, not for drama. It's just so his voice could live in the room for a little while. She picked one toward the middle of the stack, unfolded it slowly, and read it aloud in a quiet voice. It wasn't grand or poetic. It was simple. He had written about missing her laugh, about a dinner he wanted to recreate, about how just the thought of her made his hotel room feel warmer. She finished. She folded the paper carefully, held it to her chest for a moment, then placed it back in the box. I felt like I was witnessing something sacred, not a ritual, but a reunion. Later that afternoon, we stepped outside. Sky had shifted into something softer, clouds pulled back, just enough to let the sunlight slip through. We walked slowly down the sidewalk, neither of us saying much. Every few steps, she'd point to something her husband had fixed. The fence he painted. The gutter he replaced. The tree he once insisted on planting, even though she told him it would grow crooked. It did, of course. But she laughed when she said it genuinely, for the first time that day. And as she spoke, I realized this was how she kept him alive. Not just in memories, but in motion, in the way she touched the railing, the way she talked about what he built, in the way she stepped around certain cracks in the sidewalk that she said he always warned her about. This wasn't just grief. This was devotion without the expectation of return. And somehow, she didn't look broken. She looked whole in a way I hadn't noticed before, like grief had carved out space inside her heart instead of closing it. Off by the time I was ready to leave, the sun had dipped just low enough to set everything in a golden hue. We stood again at her door, that now familiar place where so many unspoken things hung in the air. She thanked me, softly, for spending the day with her. She said she hadn't expected it to mean as much as it did. I told her the truth, that it meant a lot to me too. That I hadn't realized how much I needed to witness something so real and unpolished. She nodded slowly, then did something she hadn't done before. She stepped forward and hugged me. It wasn't brief or awkward. It was warm and full and lingering, like she was trying to give something away that she'd been holding on to too tightly. I stood there for a moment after. She let go, unsure of what to say. And then she smiled, a tired but content smile, and said, "I'm okay now." I believed her. Because sometimes okay doesn't mean healed, just means not alone. After that day, something between us changed, but not in a dramatic or obvious way. It wasn't like we suddenly started holding hands or making plans for the future. No, it was quieter than that, more honest. It was in the way she said my name when I walked up the porch steps, and the way her eyes softened even before she smiled. It was in the way I started leaving my phone face down during our time together. Forgetting the clock, forgetting the world outside her little home. We didn't talk about labels or what any of this meant, and I think that's why it worked. There was no pressure to perform, no expectation to fill anyone's shoes. Just the slow, steady blooming of companionship, like a vine crawling its way up a forgotten wall. Every Thursday became a checkpoint in our week, something we both quietly looked forward to without having to admit it out loud. I started noticing how she began changing small things around the house, replacing dusty curtains with brighter ones. Buying fresh fruit she hadn't touched in months, even letting herself play music again in the background. It wasn't loud. Just the soft hum of old jazz records or gentle acoustic songs, but it was enough to change the air in the house. The silence that once felt like a tomb was now textured, filled with intention. One afternoon, she asked if I would help her reorganize the garage. It was a request that might have sounded mundane from anyone else, but from her it felt like an invitation into another hidden chapter of her life. The garage was dim and cluttered, full of boxes labeled with years and holidays and names I didn't recognize. We spent hours moving things, dusting off forgotten items, uncovering decades of accumulation that told stories without words. She found her husband's old toolbox, still intact, still smelling faintly of metal and cedar oil. Opened it slowly, her fingers brushing over the worn handles of screwdrivers and wrenches as if they were relics. I asked if she wanted to keep it, and she looked at me with a wistful expression and said yes, but not in storage. She wanted it accessible, wanted to remember that once this space had been full of life and motion and projects half finished. We found old photo albums in a sealed container at the back of the shelves, and she let me flip through a few. There were pictures of birthdays, road trips, beach days, where the wind caught her hair just so. There was one where she wore a red dress, standing next to him beneath a massive oak tree, both of them laughing mid-frame, completely unaware of the camera. She told me that was their 5th anniversary. It spent it planting trees in the backyard instead of going out. She said that tree still stood there now, stronger than ever. Later that day, as we were closing up the garage, she paused near the door and leaned against the frame like something was weighing her down. I looked at her and saw it something unspoken settling into her shoulders. She finally said that cleaning the garage wasn't really about tidying up. It was about making space. Not just physical space, but emotional space for herself, for new things, maybe even for me. I didn't respond right away, just stood next to her and let the silence do what it needed to. And then, after a few minutes, she looked up and said that when her husband died, she didn't just lose him, she lost the version of herself that existed in his eyes. The one who danced barefoot in the kitchen, who laughed too loud at bad jokes, who sang in the car even when she missed the notes. She said she missed that version of herself more than she missed anything else. I didn't try to tell her she still existed or that she could get her back. I knew better than to offer easy comfort. Instead, I told her that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't gone. Maybe that version of her had just been waiting for someone to notice she was still in there, as quiet and patient, ready to return when the house finally felt safe again. That night, I stayed longer than usual. She made dinner just soup and bread. Nothing fancy, and we ate on the back patio beneath. The soft hum of string lights, she said, had been sitting in storage for years. The air smelled of rosemary and old wood, and somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's wind chimes clinked lazily in the breeze. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Every gesture, every shared glance, felt like a sentence already spoken. Before I left, she handed me a small, folded paper, the second one she'd ever given me. Inside was another short poem, handwritten in the same careful script as before. It read, "Some days the silence wins, some days the breath comes hard, but if someone stands beside me, the darkness doesn't press as far." I didn't know what to say, so I folded it gently, pressed it into my wallet, and thanked her not just for the poem, but for the truth inside it. As I drove home, I realized that these visits weren't just helping her heal. They were changing me too. I was beginning to remember what it felt like to be needed, not for my tools or my time, but for who I was when I wasn't fixing anything. And that, more than anything, made me want to keep showing up. The next Thursday came wrapped in gold light, the kind of autumn warmth that made everything feel softer than it actually was. I had gotten used to the rhythm by now, waking up and knowing that no matter how chaotic the rest of the week had been, today would be slower, more deliberate. Her house had that same familiar feel as I stepped up onto the porch. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was becoming a ritual, a heartbeat. In my week that I didn't realize I needed so badly, the door was already unlocked, and I let myself in quietly, hearing the gentle clinking of cups in the kitchen. She turned to greet me with a calm, tired smile that somehow looked more peaceful than anything else. There was less tension in her shoulders now, less fog in her eyes. Grief was still there, but it had changed shapeless, like a crashing wave, and more like a tide that came in quietly and pulled at her from time to time. She offered me a cup of tea this time instead of coffee, said she had been trying to sleep better. I noticed a new plant on the windowsill, a small one in a chipped ceramic pot. She said she bought it on a whim, and when I asked why, she shrugged and said maybe I just wanted to see something grow again. We sat on the porch instead of inside, and for a long time, neither of us said much. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves, and the occasional car would pass by on the road below. It was one of those afternoons where the silence didn't feel like an absence, but like a presence of its own. After a while, she began talking about the early years of her marriage. Not the romantic highlights or grand gestures, but the quiet parts, the fights about nothing, the mismatched schedules. The years they worked opposite shifts and passed each other like ghosts in the hallway, she said, that no one ever talks about. Those parts, but that's what most of marriage is made of. The boring, consistent, unfiltered pieces of two people trying to figure out how to keep choosing each other, even when it's inconvenient. I listened without interrupting, letting her words settle like dust on old wood. And then she said something that struck me hard, in a way I didn't expect. She said she was learning slowly that grief wasn't just about losing a person. It was about losing the future you had already pictured with them. The imagined mornings, the quiet retirements, the holidays with grandchildren who never came. I hadn't heard anyone put it like that before, and it stayed with me long after she said it. At some point, we went for a walk down the block. She didn't used to go for walks. She said hadn't in a long time. But today she wanted to stretch her legs and feel the sun before it vanished. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where every mailbox had its own story and every tree had been planted by someone with a long-forgotten dream. As we passed one house, an older woman waved from her garden, and Mara smiled back, offering a small wave in return. She told me that the woman's name was Ruth, and they used to trade zucchini bread every summer when her husband was still alive. But after he passed, Mara had pulled back. She said people didn't know how to be around grief. They either smothered you with pity or disappeared because they didn't know what to say. And sometimes the silence from friends hurts more than the loss itself. That was why she admitted. My continued visits surprised her. Most people drop off after the first week, maybe two. But I had stayed. She asked me once again, though softly, like she didn't want to scare off the truth why. I kept coming back. I told her I didn't fully know. That maybe I needed the quiet as much as she did. That maybe I saw something in her house, her presence, her resilience, that reminded me of what it means to be human without trying to fix anything. As we made our way back to her porch, I could tell she was a little winded but satisfied. She sat down with a gentle sigh and looked out at the street as if it held answers she hadn't thought to ask for yet. I stayed with her for another hour, not because I felt obligated, but because it felt right. When it came time to leave, she stood with me, and again, like before, that hesitation at the door returned. But this time, there was no sorrow behind it, only gratitude. As I stepped down the porch steps, she called out not loudly, just enough for it to reach me, and said, "You know, I think I was wrong before about not being able to handle another goodbye. I think what I really meant was I didn't want to be left behind before I remembered how to stand again." I turned, nodded, and smiled. I didn't need to reply. We both knew what she meant. And maybe we both needed to hear it said out loud, not as a confession, but as a release. The following Thursday arrived with the scent of coming rain. Light drizzle already softening the sky by the time I reached her house. I half expected her to cancel our usual visit, thinking maybe the weather or the weight of the past few weeks might keep her inside, cocooned in her own silence. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw the porch light already on in her silhouette. Waiting by the window, there was something about the way she stood, there motionless but present, that struck me as quietly brave. I knocked gently before stepping inside, and she greeted me with a soft, familiar nod. She told me she had something different in mind today, something she hadn't done in a long time. We weren't going to sit on the porch or talk about memories or tidy the garage. Instead, she wanted to cook. Not just heat something up, but truly cook from scratch, with the radio playing and the kitchen warm. She said it was something she used to love but hadn't had the energy for since he passed. I said nothing, only rolled up my sleeves and followed her into the kitchen like it was the most natural thing in the world. The kitchen itself was a quiet time capsule. Every drawer and shelf still organized in the way her husband must have known by heart. She moved through it slowly at first, testing her memory, touching handles like they were old friends. She handed me a recipe card, slightly yellowed with time and flecked with small stains, and told me it was his favorite rosemary chicken, with lemon potatoes. As we worked, the smell began to fill the house, slowly transforming the air into something richer, more comforting. The clinking of utensils, the rhythmic chopping, the soft music playing from a dusty speaker, all of it felt sacred. It's not in a religious sense, but in that way some ordinary moments become profound because of what they represent. I noticed her hands were steadier than they had been the first day we met. Her voice, while still soft, carried more clarity. She hummed a few bars of an old song as she stirred the broth, and I let it wash over me. That quiet reminder, that healing. Doesn't always announce itself, it just shows up one day in the sound of someone singing again. When the meal was done, we didn't sit at the kitchen table like usual. She surprised me by leading us into the dining room, a space I hadn't seen her use before. It was dimly lit by a small chandelier, and the long wooden table was already set with plates and cloth napkins she must have pulled from storage. She said she hadn't used that table since the last Thanksgiving before he passed. She dusted it off that morning, deciding that if she was going to cook a real meal, she might as well do it properly. We sat across from each other, and the food between us somehow bridged a distance neither of us had noticed growing shorter. We ate slowly, almost ceremonially, not speaking much at first, as if words would disrupt the peace in the room.
Then
She began sharing stories from those Thanksgiving dinners, how her husband always carved the turkey with more confidence than skill, how he once dropped a bowl of cranberry sauce and blamed the dog. She laughed as she told it, that full, unrehearsed kind of laugh that feels like a gift. I found myself smiling not just at the story, but at the sound of her returning to herself, a piece at a time. After the dishes were washed and dried, we lingered in the living room, the storm outside now quietly tapping against the windows. She sat in her usual chair, legs tucked beneath her, and I settled on the couch with a cup of tea she had insisted I try. It was herbal, earthy, and exactly the kind of drink you don't expect to enjoy until someone thoughtful makes it for you. She turned to me and said she'd been thinking a lot about what it meant to rebuild, not just a life, but an identity. That for so long she'd been someone's wife, and when that title disappeared, she wasn't sure what remained. She said grief had this strange way of making you question your shape, what you were made of without the people who once defined you, and that being around someone who expected nothing from her had given her room to find out. I didn't say anything profound in response. I just told her I understood in my own way, that sometimes it takes sitting with someone else's silence to finally hear your own voice again. Before I left that night, she handed me something wrapped in a soft cloth. It was a photo in a wooden frame, one I hadn't seen before. It was her and her husband, younger, mid-laughter, clearly unaware of the camera. She said it was taken by a friend during a road trip in the 90s, and she'd had it tucked away in a drawer for years. She wanted me to have it not to keep forever, but to hold on to for a little while, just until the next Thursday. It was her way of trusting me with something she hadn't trusted anyone else with in a long time. I promised I'd keep it safe. As I walked to my truck in the soft drizzle, I looked down at the photograph in my hands and felt a strange warmth settle in my chest. This wasn't about fixing a car or cleaning a garage anymore. This was about memory, presence, and the quiet courage it takes to let someone witness your becoming. The following Thursday arrived carrying a stillness that felt heavier than usual, as though the air itself was bracing for something unspoken. I drove toward her house with the framed photo she had entrusted me with resting carefully on the passenger seat, wrapped in the same cloth she had given me. I found myself glancing at it at red lights, almost protective of it in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a piece of someone's soul she'd handed over to me without condition. When I pulled into her driveway, I noticed something new. Her porch had been swept. The cushions on the chairs had been fluffed, and a small bouquet of flowers sat in a jar beside the door. These weren't grand changes, but they carried weight. They said something had shifted in her, something subtle but meaningful. She opened the door before I knocked, her eyes soft and warm, and motioned for me to come in with that quiet ease we had built together. Inside, the house smelled of something faintly sweet, vanilla, maybe, or cinnamon. It wasn't overpowering, just present, like a memory trying to make itself known. I handed her the photo first, watching as her fingers paused on the cloth before unwrapping it. She looked at it for a long time, not saying anything. Then she smiled, not the wistful kind I had grown used to, but something steadier, more grounded. She placed it gently on the console table near the front hallway, where the light would catch it each afternoon. She told me she had started writing again, not full stories, just lines and fragments. Thoughts that came to her during the day when the silence stretched too far. She had filled 2 pages the night before and didn't know if they made sense, but it felt good just to put pen to paper again. I asked if she'd ever written before, and she nodded, saying that in another life, before marriage, before the long hours at work, she had wanted to be a writer. She laughed when she said it, Like it was a joke she no longer felt embarrassed by. I told her it wasn't too late, and for once, she didn't argue. She simply said, maybe, with a kind of softness that felt like the first step toward believing it. That afternoon, she invited me into a room I hadn't seen yet. It was a small sunroom, tucked in the back of the house, filled with unused furniture, stacked boxes, and forgotten knickknacks. She said it used to be her favorite room when they first moved in. They'd sit in there on Sunday mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles, sunlight pouring in while the radio played in the background. But after he died, she closed the door and hadn't opened it again until the week before. Now, she wanted to clean it up, not just to reclaim the space, but to feel the light again. So we spent the next few hours sorting through boxes, dusting shelves, and clearing out the clutter that had settled like time itself. I found a stack of old records in one corner and set up a small player she had tucked away behind a stack of holiday decorations. When the music started, her shoulders dropped slightly, her movements more fluid. The room, which had once been sealed in grief, began to breathe again, slowly and deliberately.
Ow.
By the time we were finished, the sun had dipped low, casting golden beams through the glass that lit up the floor like liquid amber. She stood in the center, arms crossed over her chest, and just looked around. Without as though she were reacquainting herself with a piece of her past she thought had disappeared. As I was getting ready to leave, she reached for something from the side table and handed it to me, a small folded envelope with my name written on it. She told me not to read it there, just to take it with me and open it whenever I felt like I needed to. There was no explanation, no urgency, just a look in her eyes that said it mattered. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and promised I would. As I walked to my truck, the sky had turned a soft shade of lavender, and the first stars were beginning to show. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, holding the envelope. I was unsure if I wanted to open it right then, or let it sit with me a little longer. Eventually, curiosity won. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate. The note wasn't long, just a paragraph, really, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. She had written that in all. The months since he passed, she had stopped believing that anyone could see her without pity or expectation. But for some reason, she felt seen again, not for her grief, but for the woman she was before it. And even if nothing ever changed between us, even if I never visited again, she would be grateful for that reminder, for being witnessed, not mourned. The envelope sat on my nightstand for days after I read it, folded and refolded, almost like a talisman. I didn't have the heart to put it away in a drawer or tuck it into a book. Every morning, I'd glance at it, and somehow it would steady me before the chaos of the day began. It wasn't the words themselves, though they were powerful, it was the weight of being seen. Truly seen, without the layers we all wear in front of the world. Mara had offered something rare with that note. It's vulnerability without the demand. For anything in return, that kind of openness stays with you. It humbles you. And for the rest of that week, I caught myself carrying her voice in the back of my mind, not like a song or a quote, but more like a quiet wind that shifts your direction without asking permission. I began to see small moments differently. The woman in the grocery store who paused too long in front of the soup cans, the man at the gas station who tapped his steering wheel to the beat of a song only he could hear. Everyone carried something: grief, hope, loneliness, resilience. And Mara, in her quiet way, had reminded me of that. When Thursday came again, it was different. The air felt lighter, and the sky had that crispness that only comes when seasons begin to tilt into something new. I pulled up to her house, and before I could knock, she opened the door with a kind of ease that wasn't there before. Her eyes didn't carry that same fragile glaze anymore. Instead, there was something almost playful about her expression, as if she had been waiting with anticipation rather than dread. She said she wanted to show me something and led me to the backyard. I hadn't spent much time back. There was just glimpses from the kitchen window or a passing view as I'd loaded tools into my truck. But now it had been transformed. Not drastically, but intentionally. The old patio table had been cleaned, a few candles placed at the center. There were 2 chairs with cushions, and beside them, a small planter box that hadn't been there before. She said she started it last weekend, just herbs and a few flowers, but it made the mornings feel purposeful again. She told me that. When she watered the plants, it reminded her that not everything needed to bloom quickly to have value. Some things could take their time. Just like her, we sat outside longer than usual, sipping on tea she had brewed from the herbs growing right there in the box. The light from the sun fell in patches through the branches above, and for a while we didn't speak. We didn't need. 2. There was comfort now in the silence between us, not from avoidance, but from trust. She began to tell me about a trip they never got to take. She and her husband had planned to go to Oregon to see the coast, to walk along the cliffs and listen to the sea. She said they had saved for it for years, but then he got sick, and the trip turned into something they only spoke of in past tense. She said for the longest time, she kept the travel brochures tucked in a drawer as a reminder of what never was. But last week, she threw them out. Not in anger or bitterness, but in acceptance. She said maybe one day she'd still see the coast, maybe not. But she no longer needed the weight of the almost to define her. I remember watching her speak, her eyes steady, her voice even, and realizing how far she'd come. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was reclaiming pieces of herself with each new breath. Later, as the sun began to dip, casting a golden hue across the garden, she brought out something unexpected, a box of old recipes. Not the neat, organized kind, but the chaotic, handwritten. Notes and clipped magazine pages that had lived in her kitchen drawer for decades. She said she wanted to go through them, toss what no longer mattered, and keep the ones that still felt like home. We spread them out on the patio table, and for the next hour, we sorted memories disguised as ingredients. Some cards had smudges. From past dinners, notes in the margins, measurements crossed out and adjusted over time. Each one told a story not just of meals, but of moments. Family gatherings, burned crusts, inside jokes. We ended up laughing at how many versions of banana bread she had, none of which she claimed were actually good. When the box was nearly empty, she picked up one last card, folded and yellowing at the edges. She held it for a while, then said, softly, that it was his handwriting. A stew they used to make together on Sundays. She read it quietly, and I let her have that moment, not intruding, just existing nearby in case she needed to remember she wasn't alone. By the time I left that evening, the stars had begun to peek out, scattered faintly across the sky. She walked me to the door, but this time there was no heaviness, no pause filled with unsaid words. She thanked me for staying, for showing up, for not making her healing feel like a burden. I told her it never was, not even once. And as I walked down the steps to my truck, she called out behind Manad as a plea, but as a promise that she'd have something else to show me next week, something small but hers. I didn't need to know what it was. It was enough to know. She was looking forward, not backward. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding a way to live again without apologizing for the scar. And somehow, in her garden, in her recipes, in the way she was beginning to smile without flinching, Mara was doing just that. The next Thursday arrived with the gentle hum of spring in the air. It's the kind of day where the breeze carries the scent of warm earth and faraway blossoms, as if the whole world is reminding you that new things are always possible. I drove toward her house with a strange mix of anticipation and calm, that quiet awareness that something meaningful had been growing between us, not fast or dramatic, but steady like roots anchoring into the ground. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the blinds were open, the windows slightly cracked to let the fresh air in, and a soft jazz tune floated out faintly from inside. It wasn't the kind of house that looked drastically different from when I first arrived, but the energy had changed. There was life in the small details, the polished windowsills, the swept porch, the presence of her again in the way a home feels when its owner has come back to themselves. She opened the door without hesitation this time, greeting me with, a familiar look that felt both warm and quietly grateful. She didn't need to say much. The comfort between us was already there. She led me to the sunroom, where we had cleared out boxes just 2 weeks before, and I was surprised to find a small writing desk tucked into one corner near the light. On top were notebooks, a mug of tea, and what looked like her old typewriter now cleaned and polished. She told me she'd been writing in the mornings, not every day, but enough to make her feel like the habit might stick. She laughed softly. When she said the words didn't always make sense, but she was learning not to judge the mess. That some days she only wrote a sentence or two, and others, the pages spilled out like water. I told her it was brave to start again, but she shook her head and said it wasn't bravery, it was survival. She said writing reminded her that she still had a voice, and even if no one ever read the words, it helped her hear herself clearly for the first time in a long while. As I listened, I realized how rarely we allow ourselves to create without purpose, to write not for an audience, but for healing. And I knew then that what she was doing in this little sunroom wasn't about becoming a writer, it was about becoming herself again. Later, sat out on the patio with 2 glasses of cold lemonade, the kind you sip slowly while the world softens. Around you, she showed me a small stack of books. She had ordered novels, poetry, old cookbooks, and said she was trying to fall in love with quiet hobbies again. Things she used to enjoy before grief made everything feel heavy and pointless. She said she was tired of surviving her days and wanted to learn how to live inside them again. That meant slowing down, being deliberate, letting her hours be filled with more than just memory. I watched as she thumbed through one of the books, pointing out recipes she wanted to try or quotes she had underlined. There was something beautiful in the way she curated her healing, not dramatic, not sweeping, but intimate and personal. It wasn't about getting better in the way others might expect. It was about reclaiming control over her own story. And it struck me just how many people suffer silently because they think healing has to look like moving on, when sometimes it simply looks like sitting down and giving yourself permission to try again. As the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the lawn, she told me she had reached out to an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to since the funeral. She admitted it was awkward, stilted at first, but after a few minutes, the rhythm returned. They talked for an hour, laughed a little, cried a little more. She said it reminded her that she wasn't alone, that even the friends who had fallen quiet weren't necessarily gone. They just didn't know how to step back in without breaking something fragile. I told her it was brave, and this time she didn't argue. She said maybe it was, that reaching out again had felt like standing on the edge of something and deciding to lean forward instead of stepping back. And then she paused, looked at me for a long moment, and said, I think I've been standing on that edge for a long time. I didn't need to ask what she meant. I could see it in her, the weeks of quiet work, the tiny shifts, the slow resurrection of a woman who had thought her story might have ended long before it actually did. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just witnessing her healing. I was part of it before I left. She handed me a small envelope again. This time it wasn't a note. Inside was a photograph, not of her or her husband, but of her garden. The planter box, the herbs, the candles, the soft glow of evening light captured with perfect timing. She said she took it the night before and wanted me to have a copy. So you'll remember what you helped me grow, she said, almost like a whisper. I didn't know how to respond. There was no grand gesture I could offer in return, no words big enough to hold what she had given me. But I thanked her quietly and tucked the photo into my jacket, knowing I would treasure it. As I walked to my truck, the porch light turned on behind me, casting a golden halo around her front door. And I realized that this house, this woman, this quiet ritual of Thursdays had changed me too. What began as a simple act of fixing a car battery had unraveled into something much deeper. It had become a journey through grief, through healing, through connection. And as I drove away that night, the photo on the seat beside me, I knew we weren't nearing the end of the story. We were still in the middle of it, where all the real living happens. That following Thursday carried with it the kind of quiet that feels intentional. The sky was overcast, soft gray clouds covering the sun like a blanket, as if even the weather knew some days needed gentleness. I pulled up to her house with no expectations, only a sense of comfort I hadn't realized had grown so deep. The rhythm of these visits had taken on the cadence of ritual familiar, grounding, without needing grand plans or explanations. I parked the truck, and before I could even knock, she opened the door with that same peaceful steadiness she'd begun to wear like second skin. She was wearing a sweater that looked handmade, her hair pulled back in the way people do when they're relaxed in their own space. She smiled not out of politeness, but with that subtle expression that comes when someone is glad to see you. Truly glad without pretense. She told me we'd stay in today, not because she was tired or sad, but because she wanted to share something personal, something she had unearthed during the past week while sorting through boxes in the back of the closet. Without saying more, she led me to the living room, where a small stack of journals rested on the coffee table like delicate cargo. She told me they were hers. Journals she had started decades ago, some barely filled, others packed with thoughts, dreams, fragments of a life that had gone quiet for a while. She hadn't looked at them in years, not since before the diagnosis, before the grief crept in and rearranged everything. For a long time, she said, even touching them felt impossible, like opening a door she wasn't ready to walk through. But last week, something shifted. She had pulled them down from the shelf and page by page began reading who she used to be. There were entries from when she was 20 and traveling alone for the first time. Notes from her early days of marriage, bits of recipes taped inside, pieces of letters, old pressed leaves she must have found during a hike. Her handwriting changed over the years, sometimes confident, sometimes shaky. She admitted some pages were hard to read, especially the ones toward the end, where her words were filled with fear, confusion, and aching loneliness. But there were also parts that made her laugh. She said she had forgotten how funny she used to be, how poetic her thoughts could get when she let herself drift into metaphors. She offered me one of the journals to read, not all of it, just a page she had bookmarked. I hesitated, unsure if it was too private, but she insisted. The page was simple, a list, actually. Things she wanted to do before she turned 50. Wasn't full of bucket list cliches. It was things like paint a wall lavender, host a dinner with mismatched chairs, take a walk without checking the time, and learn how to say no without guilt. I handed the book back to her, and we both sat in silence for a while. Not out of awkwardness, but out of reverence for a younger version of her that was still alive inside. She then brought out a small wooden box and placed it on the table between us. It had a brass latch and a smooth lid, clearly worn from years of handling. Inside were photographs, not many, just a dozen or so, each one carefully preserved in individual sleeves. She said these were the photos she hadn't been able to look at after the funeral, photos that held too much life to coexist with death. There was one of her husband in their backyard, wearing a ridiculous straw hat and holding a garden hose like a weapon. Another of them dancing in the kitchen, mid-whirl, her laughter frozen in motion. Polaroid from a camping trip where their tent had collapsed and they slept under the stars instead. She handed me the one that meant the most to her, a picture taken by accident. The camera had been set down on a timer, but the shot caught them between poses, just looking at each other, unaware the photo had been taken. She said that was the moment she always went back to in her mind. It's not because of how they looked, but because of how it felt. Unposed, unguarded, completely present. I looked at the photo for a long time, understanding now what it meant to carry a moment like that in your bones. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. As the afternoon light shifted through the windows, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. She wanted to know what my life had looked like before we met. Not the edited version I sometimes offered out of politeness or habit, but the truth of it. Where had I come from? Who had I been before this strange rhythm of Thursdays became the anchor I didn't realize I needed? It caught me off guard. Not because I didn't want to share, because so few people ask with the kind of sincerity that makes you want to answer fully. I told her about the years I spent floating between jobs. Not because I didn't have ambition, but because I hadn't found anything worth building toward. I spoke about the loneliness that crept in quietly after my father died, about the way I had avoided relationships not out of fear but out of fatigue, that showing up for someone had always felt heavy until now. Somehow, showing up for her felt like breathing. She just reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. Not to console, not to fix, but to witness. And in that stillness, I felt seen in the same way I had tried to see her as I prepared to leave. She walked me to the door again, and for the first time, she hugged me. It wasn't dramatic or awkward. It was quiet, meaningful, and certain. The kind of embrace that says more than words ever could. She whispered that she wasn't afraid of goodbyes anymore. Not because they didn't hurt, but because she had learned that every goodbye held space for a beginning too. That even if nothing ever stayed the same, what we give to each other remains. I drove home that evening with the feeling of her journals still lingering in my mind. Her photographs etched into the corners of my heart, and her voice echoing in a way that made me realize something deeply important. This wasn't just a chapter in her life. It wasn't even just a chapter in mine. This was the kind of story that reshapes the way you view time, love, and connection itself. Not through grand gestures or perfect timing, but through the steady, quiet showing up that turns strangers into something more, something like home. The following week arrived with the kind of clarity only spring mornings can bring. The air smelled of dew and jasmine, soft clouds drifting lazily above rooftops, and birdsong tracing invisible lines across the sky. I remember noticing how even my drive to her place felt different now, like each turn of the wheel was taking me deeper into a place that existed outside the normal noise of life. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already outside, sitting on the porch swing with a cup of tea cradled in her hands and a blanket draped over her lap. She looked at peace, her posture relaxed, eyes gazing out toward nothing in particular, like she was watching the breeze instead of the world. She waved me over before I could even step out of the truck. There was no urgency, no task waiting, just an invitation to sit beside her in that rare kind of silence, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. I joined her on the swing, and we simply sat for a while, letting the rhythm of its gentle creak hold the space between us like a shared heartbeat. It was one of those moments you don't realize is sacred until much later. Eventually, she spoke. Not with heaviness, but with purpose. She said she had written a letter. Not to me, not to anyone living. It was addressed to her late husband. Hadn't planned it. The words just came out one night, unannounced, spilling onto paper like water finding its way through cracks. She didn't read it to me, and I didn't ask to hear it. It wasn't mine to carry. But she told me writing it helped her put certain feelings down, not to let go of them entirely, but to acknowledge them, to stop pretending they didn't still live in the quiet corners of her. She said she realized she had been waiting for permission to move forward, not from anyone else, but from herself. That letter was her way of giving it. I looked at her and noticed how different she seemed. Not happier, not fixed, but more whole. Grief had shaped her, yes, but it no longer defined the borders of who she was. There was space now for something else to grow, something that didn't erase what came before but honored it. By making room for what could come next, she asked me then if I wanted to take a walk, not down the street or around the neighborhood, but through the small wooded path that bordered the edge of her backyard. I hadn't even known it existed. It was narrow, mostly overgrown, but she said it had once been a favorite route, a place she and her husband used to escape to when the world felt too loud. We followed the trail slowly, branches brushing against our shoulders, the scent of damp earth rising around us. She pointed out a tree with initials carved into the bark, long faded but still visible. Told me they had done that one summer night after a bottle of wine and too many jokes about being young forever. As we walked, I could feel the weight of years hanging from the trees like invisible fruit, each step stirring old echoes. But instead of sorrow, there was something else in the air, something resembling gratitude. She wasn't taking me there to revisit pain. She was sharing a piece of her joy. And I understood then that healing sometimes means reclaiming the places you once loved, even if they carry the fingerprints of someone you lost. When we returned to the house, she invited me to stay for dinner. She had prepared something simpler, stew made from one of the old recipes we'd sorted through weeks before. The kitchen was filled with the scent of garlic, thyme, and slow-cooked comfort. We moved around the kitchen with ease, not needing to speak much, just existing in a kind of harmony that had grown naturally over time. As the food simmered, she pulled out 2 bowls and a pair of mismatched spoons, laughing that she still hadn't gotten around to buying a full set. We ate at the small table near the window, the one she had started writing beside again. Light outside was fading into that deep blue of early evening, where every shadow feels softer and every sound more tender. Over dinner, she asked about my week, not the surface stuff, but the real things. Had I felt rested? Had I spoken to my mother recently? Was I still avoiding the painting I'd told her months ago I wanted to finish? She remembered every little thing, and it made me realize how rare that kind of attention is. In a world full of distractions, she had chosen to remember me. And in that space, I felt something shift. As I was getting ready to leave, she walked me to the door, just like every week. But this time, instead of just saying goodbye, she handed me a small, folded piece of paper. For later, she said, "No pressure." I nodded, tucked it into my pocket, and gave her a small smile before heading to my truck. I didn't open it right away. Waited until I was home, sitting in the quiet of my living room with the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound around me. The note was handwritten, as always, her script steady. It simply said, "Thank you for not rushing my sadness. Thank you for listening when I didn't know what I was saying. Thank you for being the one person who didn't ask me to be okay." Before I was ready, I don't know where this goes, but I want to find out with you if that's something you'd be open to. I read it twice, then again, and in that moment, the entire journey changing her car battery. The tears, the letters, the journals, the walks, all of it came into focus. This wasn't just a story about helping someone fix what was broken. It was about being there long, enough to see what could be rebuilt. The morning after reading her note, I didn't rush to reply. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted my answer to be something more than just a reaction. I sat with it, let the words breathe, let them settle in the parts of me that had been cautiously quiet since the day I met her. In truth, something had been growing between us long before she put it on paper, something unspoken but not unclear. It was in the way she looked at me now, not just with appreciation, but with a softness that held possibility. It was in the way she listened without interruption, how she remembered the small things I said, even when I forgot I had said them. That kind of presence doesn't arrive by accident. It builds slowly, intentionally, without fanfare. It had taken root in both of us. I wasn't the man who had come to fix a battery anymore, and she wasn't the woman crying on the steps. We had both changed, piece by piece, in the quiet spaces we made for each other. And now the question wasn't whether. Something was there, it was whether we were ready to name it. That Thursday, I arrived a little earlier than usual. The air had that golden hue that only comes before sunset, where everything looks just a little more beautiful than it did an hour before. She greeted me with the same calm smile, but there was a spark in her eyes, a quiet awareness that something unspoken was now hovering between us. She didn't ask if I had read the note. She didn't need to. Instead, she invited me inside, where the table was already set for 2 and a pot of something warm simmered on the stove. The room smelled of rosemary and garlic, and that familiar scent of safety I had come to associate with her home. We didn't rush through dinner. We lingered. We let the conversation wander from light to meaningful, from memories to ideas, as though we were slowly laying down bricks for something solid. After the dishes were cleared and the kitchen lights dimmed, we sat in the living room with tea, not speaking, just letting the silence say what we both knew. Then, finally, I reached into my jacket and pulled out the note I had written. It was only a few lines, simple, direct, honest. I told her I hadn't planned on any of this, but somehow it had become the most natural thing in my life. I told her I didn't know what the future looked like, but I knew I wanted her in it. Her eyes never left mine as she read it, and when she finished, she didn't speak right away. She just reached over and took my hand, lacing her fingers with mine, as if we'd been doing that forever. From that moment, everything felt both incredibly new and deeply familiar. We didn't rush into anything. There was no need to define what we were with labels or timelines. We just kept showing up on Thursdays, on quiet Sunday mornings, on Tuesday nights when one of us couldn't sleep. The days began to stretch outside of our previous schedule until time itself stopped feeling like a boundary and started feeling like a bridge. I helped her rearrange the furniture in her guest room, which she'd decided to turn into an art space. She helped me repaint the hallway in my apartment, even though we ended up choosing the wrong color and laughing about it every time we walked past. We went to the farmer's market one weekend, not because we needed anything, but because we liked the way the morning sun hit the stalls and how the vendors always remembered her name. She started baking again, experimenting with old recipes and inviting me to taste tests where half the fun was in the failures. We began building a rhythm, not one dictated by loss or healing anymore, but one shaped by intention and discovery. There was a lightness to us now, the kind that only comes when two people have walked through their own darkness and decided not to hide it from each other. Still, we never forgot where it all began. Sometimes she'd glance at the driveway and say something like, "I still can't believe you showed up that day." And I'd smile and tell her I almost didn't, that it was just a last-minute job I'd taken to fill a gap in my schedule. We both knew that wasn't true anymore. It hadn't been just a job for a long time. It was a turning point. A collision of two lives at the exact moment they needed each other most. We kept the photo she gave Mitha, one of her garden framed, on a small shelf by her front door. A reminder not of what we fixed, but what we grew. And sometimes when I'd catch her looking at it, her expression would shift slightly. It's like she was remembering a version of herself she thought she'd lost and seeing how far she'd come. We never talked much about timelines. We didn't count days or weeks or mark anniversaries. But we did acknowledge milestones in our own way. The first time she introduced me to her sister over the phone. The first time I told her about my father's old guitar and played it for her on a rainy afternoon. These weren't grand declarations. They were threads in a larger tapestry we were quietly weaving together. Looking back, it's still hard to believe how it all unfolded. How a dying car battery became the doorway to something alive. How two people, bruised by time but not broken, found each other in the quiet corners of everyday life. It wasn't a story made of dramatic confessions or cinematic moments. It was built on Thursdays, open notebooks and shared meals. On laughter that returned like a familiar tune. On grief that wasn't erased but gently folded into the background like a worn photograph in a cherished album. We didn't promise each other forever. We promised to keep showing up. And maybe that's what love really is. Not a guarantee, but a choice made over and over again in the small spaces where healing begins and hope decides to stay. Autumn came slowly that year, slipping into the days like a whisper rather than a storm. The air began to carry a soft chill in the mornings. The trees lining her street began to change not all at once, but one leaf at a time, as if easing into the transformation. I noticed she'd started keeping a small blanket folded over the back of the porch swing, and sometimes I'd catch her sitting out there alone, cradling a cup of tea, wrapped in quiet reflection. The changes weren't just in the season. They were in the way she moved through her home now, with confidence, with presence. There was a light in her steps, not hurried or urgent, but grounded. She had filled her calendar with simple things: writing club every other Thursday, weekly dinners with her niece, a pottery class she'd joined on a whim. The house itself felt warmer somehow, not just physically, but emotionally. You could feel it in the way she hummed to herself while tidying up, in the way she lit a candle in the evenings even when no guests were expected. There was a stillness, but it wasn't stagnant. It was peace. And watching her in those moments, I understood what it meant to live again after loss, not to return to who you were before, and to become someone whole again in an entirely new. Weighed out one Thursday, as we sat at the kitchen table with our usual cups of coffee, she brought out a manila envelope and placed it between us. She told me she'd decided to finally submit one of her essays to a local magazine. It wasn't about recognition or publication. It was about ownership, about allowing her voice to exist outside the safety of her journals. She said she didn't expect anything to come of it, but writing the cover letter alone had felt like crossing a bridge. I watched her as she explained her thought process, how long she'd debated which piece to choose. how she'd hesitated over her word choices, then laughed about how many times she had printed and reprinted that letter before sealing it. There was a quiet triumph in her. Tone, not pride exactly, but a kind of inner applause. I realized then how far she had come from that first day we met. How the woman who once feared even saying goodbye could now send her thoughts into the world with no guarantee of return. She asked me if I'd read the piece she submitted, and when I nodded, she reached for the drawer and pulled out a clean copy. It was titled The Unseen Corners. And it was beautiful not just because it was well written, but because every word felt earned. Her voice on the page was the same one I had come to know over months of conversation, gentle, layered, and deeply human. Over time, our routines became less about the car battery that started it all, and more about the spaces we built in between. We began sharing parts of our lives that had nothing to do with grief or repair books we loved, movies we remembered, even the music we once danced to. One Saturday afternoon, she invited me to her niece's birthday gathering, a small backyard. Celebration with balloons, grilled food, and the easy joy of kids running through the grass. It wasn't a big affair, but it felt like a milestone nonetheless. Not long ago, she would have politely declined such invites, or stayed on the edge of the crowd, offering quiet smiles but no conversation. This time she introduced me warmly, held my hand once or twice, and even laughed out loud when one of the kids sprayed her with a rogue water balloon. Later, we stood by the fence, sipping lemonade as the sun began to lower. She looked around at the Scene family, noise, celebration, and told me that these moments used to feel like echoes of a life she no longer belonged to. Now, they felt like chapters she was willing to write again. She wasn't trying to erase what had happened to her. She was finally learning how to carry it differently. By late October, the trees had nearly shed their leaves, and the early evenings stretched longer into the dark. One Thursday, she asked if I'd help her bring down the old holiday decorations from the attic. It was something she hadn't done since her husband passed. She said she wasn't sure yet if she'd actually put anything up, but just taking them out felt like a meaningful gesture. The attic was musty and filled with memory. Boxes labeled in his handwriting, ornaments wrapped in newspaper from years ago, strands of tangled lights, forgotten keepsakes. We didn't rush the process. She took her time opening each box, sometimes pausing, sometimes smiling. At one point, she pulled out a small, handmade ornament, 2 figures, carved from wood, hand-painted and chipped from age. She said they'd made it during their first year of marriage, a craft fair souvenir turned annual tradition. She held it for a long time before carefully placing it aside. When we brought everything down, we set the boxes in the living room. She said she wasn't ready to decorate yet, but this year, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel afraid to look at the past. And that, she said, was more than enough for now. As I helped her close the attic door, I thought about how much courage it takes to revisit the places that once held only pain, and how remarkable it is to do so, not with dread, but with grace. In those final weeks of autumn were no dramatic declarations, no definitive turning points, just the continued unfolding of 2 lives now interwoven through presence and choice. Our connection had become less about healing wounds and more about building something from what remained. One evening, we sat on the back porch beneath the soft glow of string lights she'd finally decided to hang again. She leaned into my shoulder, sipping her tea, and said, "I don't think I would have made it through this season without you." I told her I hadn't realized how much I needed her too. It was simple, said without ceremony, but in that moment, we both knew the truth. What we had found was not just comfort, it was a kind of love that doesn't arrive loudly, but roots itself quietly, through time, patience, and shared breath. A love that honors what was lost without becoming a replacement for it. A love that doesn't demand healing, but invites it. And as the cool air wrapped around us and the first stars began to appear, I understood that what we were living wasn't just a chapter. It was its own story. A story we'd keep writing, not out of urgency, but out of choice. The first snowfall arrived quietly, without warning. I woke up to a muted world, blanketed in white. The usual sounds of the city softened beneath the hush of fresh powder. It wasn't heavy, just enough to paint the roofs, the trees, the streets, in a thin coat of frost-kissed beauty. By the time I made my way to her house, the driveway was already cleared. I found her in the front yard brushing off the top of her mailbox with mittened hands. Cheeks flushed from the cold, a knitted hat pulled down over her ears. She looked up and smiled with that subtle spark I had come to know, not a smile for. Show but one that said, "You're here, and I'm glad." We didn't speak at first. I just reached out and took the snow shovel from her without asking, and she handed it over with no protest. Walking back up the steps as if we'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. Inside, the warmth hit like a gentle hug. The house smelled of cinnamon and cloves, and she already had 2 mugs of cocoa waiting on the kitchen table. We sat there, wrapped in silence and steaming mugs, watching the snow fall through the window like a curtain being gently drawn across the day. She told me she'd put up the decorations after all, the ornaments, the lights, even the little wooden figures we'd found in the attic. She said it had been hard at first in packing memories one by one, but somewhere along the way it stopped, feeling like she was disturbing ghosts, and started feeling like she was inviting them to stay, not as pain, but as part of the foundation. I could see the change in the way her eyes moved around the room, no longer scanning for what was missing, but resting on what was still here. The tree stood tall in the corner, adorned with mismatched ornaments, a patchwork of decades lived and loved. There were old decorations with names written in faded marker, new ones she'd picked up on a whim during a solo trip to the craft store, and one that I recognized immediately, the wooden ornament with the chipped paint she had held so tenderly weeks before. It was placed near the center, not hidden away, but proudly displayed, as if saying, "This too belongs." She had even wrapped a few small gifts and placed them beneath the tree, though we both knew it wasn't about the presents. It was about the gesture, the act of participating again, the act of allowing joy to return, even if it arrived quietly. That day, she asked if I'd help her with something new. Not fixing or lifting or sorting, but something much more vulnerable. She had decided to record herself reading her favorite essay, the one she had submitted to the magazine. She said it wasn't for anyone else, just for herself, a way to mark this moment in time, a way to capture her voice, not just the sound of it, but the strength she had reclaimed. We set up her phone on a small tripod in the corner of the living room, angled just right to catch the light from the window. She sat on the couch with the printed pages in her lap, took a deep breath, and began. First, but as she moved through the lines, it settled, grew sure. By the end, her eyes were glistening, but she didn't apologize. She simply pressed stop and let the silence fill the space. Then she turned to me and said, "I'm proud of myself." I've never said that out loud before. And in that moment, I realized just how much bravery looks like this quiet acts of showing up. Over and over until one day you realize you've built something solid from the pieces of what once broke you. The weeks that followed unfolded gently. Our visits continued, some long, some short, all meaningful in their own way. We fell into a rhythm that felt like home. Sometimes we spoke about the future, not in sweeping declarations, but in small hints. She asked once if I'd ever thought about moving out of the city, somewhere quieter. I asked her if she'd ever considered starting a blog to share her writing. These weren't questions with expectations attached. They were seeds. Possibilities planted with care, left to grow. In their own time, one snowy evening, we sat on her porch bundled in blankets, watching the flakes drift beneath the soft glow of the string lights. She told me she'd had a dream the night before one where she was driving down a long country road. Windows down, music playing, the wind in her hair. She said in the dream she wasn't driving away from anything. She was just moving forward, freely and without fear. I didn't tell her at the time, but I'd had a similar dream not long before Lee and mine. I wasn't behind the wheel. I was in the passenger seat, letting go of control for once, trusting the road ahead. Maybe that's what love becomes after grief. Not a rescue, not a replacement, but a road traveled side by side, knowing full well that both people have walked through fire and still chose to open the car door for someone new. By the time December arrived in full, we found ourselves not just preparing for the holidays, but preparing for change. She had received an email from the magazine. Her essay had been accepted. Not only that, but they wanted to feature her as a guest contributor for the season. Her eyes welled up when she read the message out loud, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't just a win, it was validation. Proof that her voice mattered, that her story had worth, that her life, even in its quietest chapters, was still offering something beautiful to the world. We celebrated with takeout and a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a good reason, but we both agreed later that this reason was far better than what she had imagined when she bought it. As we clinked our glasses and laughed about the sappy email signature the editor had used, I looked at her early-looked hand, saw not the woman I had met months ago in a moment of vulnerability, but someone who had stitched herself back together in the most honest, imperfect way. And somehow, in the process of helping her, I had done the same for myself without even realizing it. We weren't just part of each other's story. We were each other's turning point. The night the magazine published her essay online, we sat together on her couch, the only light in the room coming from the Christmas tree and the soft glow of her laptop screen. She had waited all day to open the email with the link, wanting to read it for the first time with me beside her. When the page finally loaded, she leaned in slowly, as if afraid that acknowledging her own success might somehow erase it. But it was there, her words, her name, her journey laid out plainly for anyone to see. There was something quiet and sacred about that moment, watching her trace each line with her eyes, not for grammar or rhythm, but for truth. Her hand rested gently on the edge of the keyboard, unmoving, as though the act of seeing herself reflected back in her own words had momentarily rooted her to the spot. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. We both knew what this meant. It wasn't just about being published. It was about being seen, being heard, being real in a world that often demands we hide our most broken pieces. When she finally looked up, her expression wasn't one of giddy celebration. It was calm, certain. She said she felt like she had come full circle, not back to who she was, forward into who she was meant to become. And in that stillness, wrapped in soft lights and shared silence, I understood that healing isn't loud. It's not a grand finale. It's a quiet arrival. In the days that followed, there was a gentle shift in our rhythm. We had already grown. Close, intertwined in ways neither of us had planned, but now there was an ease that came from standing on the other side of something hard. She started receiving messages from readers, strangers who resonated with her words, who saw themselves in her story. She shared a few of those messages with me, eyes shimmering with gratitude. There was a widow in Minnesota who said the essay made her cry for the first time in years. A college student in Oregon who wrote about losing her mother and never knowing how to talk about it until now. Even a middle-aged man from Canada who simply said, "Thank you. You said what I couldn't." Each note was a thread, weaving her back into a world she had once retreated from. It gave her purpose, not in the grand world-changing way people often expect, but in the deeply human way of connection. She began drafting new pieces, scribbling ideas in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, sometimes reading me lines as she cooked or folded laundry. Her voice, once tentative, now carried weight. She no longer asked for permission to speak her truth. She simply did. And as I watched her grow bolder, more open, more herself, I found that I too was changing, not dramatically, but in the way a tree straightens after a long winter, not forcing anything, just slowly turning toward the sun. Around this time, I started spending more evenings at her house, not out of necessity, but out of comfort. It became normal to find myself there after work, helping with dinner or fixing a loose drawer, or simply sitting together with the TV playing in the background. Half-watched, there was no urgency, no need to impress or perform, we just were. She would fall asleep sometimes during movies, her head resting gently on my shoulder. And I'd sit there in the dark, not moving, not wanting to disturb the peace that had taken so long to return to her life. Sometimes I'd wake up to find that she'd covered me with a blanket after I'd dozed off, the coffee table cleared, the lights dimmed. We began sharing small routines, the way she always made tea before bed, how I liked to organize her toolbox even though she never asked, how she hummed when she was deep in thought, and how I started recognizing each tune. These weren't grand gestures. but they were intimate in the way that only quiet familiarity can be. One day, without really planning it, I brought over a spare set of clothes and left them in her guest room drawer. No. She noticed but didn't say anything, just smiled in that way she did when words would only get in the way. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just visiting anymore. I was arriving. Winter deepened, and the holidays brought with them a kind of reflection neither of us had quite prepared for. There were memories, some sharp, some warm, that surfaced uninvited. She admitted to me one night that she still cried, sometimes alone, not because she missed her husband more than before, but because the absence had changed shape. It wasn't jagged anymore, just hollow. A space once filled with routine and laughter and shared glances across a dinner table. She told me she worried that moving forward might someday make her forget the details: his voice, the sound of his laugh, the exact way he tied his shoelaces. I listened, not to fix, but to witness, to hold space for her in the way she had always done for me. I told her it was okay to carry both love and loss, that honoring what was didn't mean denying what is, that she wasn't betraying him by opening her heart again. She was honoring him by continuing to live, fully and without apology. She leaned into me that night, not needing answers, just presence, and I held her silently until her breathing slowed and the weight of the moment settled into something gentler. We fell asleep that way, not as to people chasing healing, but as to people who had found it together, in the spaces no one else could see, as the year neared its end. There was a feeling in the air, a soft promise, an unspoken understanding, that the worst had passed, but the best was still unfolding. One evening, as we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the snow fall under the glow of the porch light, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you ever think about staying?" she said, not as an ultimatum, not as a plea, just a thought spoken into the air, like a stone dropped into a still pond. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. Because the truth was, I had already stayed. In every shared moment, every repaired drawer, every late-night conversation, and every ordinary Thursday that had slowly become extraordinary. I had chosen her quietly, consistently, without fanfare. So I nodded, not as a promise, but as a confirmation of something already true. Snow kept falling. The lights flickered in the living room window. For the first time in a long time, we weren't just surviving a season. We were living it. Together, the first week of January brought with it a calm quietness, as though the world itself had exhaled after the weight of the holidays. Her street, once dotted with twinkling lights and inflatable snowmen, was now lined with bare trees and cold sidewalks, the signs of festivity slowly being tucked away. But inside her home, a warmth still lingered. The decorations had come down, but she had left the string lights up on the back porch, saying they made the evenings feel less lonely. I continued to visit every week, sometimes more, and what had once felt like a comforting routine now felt like a foundation. We had entered that phase of quiet companionship that only time and vulnerability could forge, a space where two people didn't have to fill every silence or chase after excitement to feel alive. She had started working on a second essay, one more personal than the last. And she often read drafts to me in the late evenings when the snow pressed up against the windows like soft static. I had started leaving more things at her house, an old sweatshirt I always forgot I left on her armchair, my toothbrush in the second drawer in her bathroom, a half-full box of cereal I brought over one morning and never took back. None of these gestures were bold or dramatic, but they carried a quiet permanence, the kind you don't announce, but simply live into. Little by little. One morning, after the first heavy snowstorm of the year, I arrived to find her in the backyard shoveling, a narrow path from her garage to the garden shed. She looked up when she saw me and laughed, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes squinting against the morning sun bouncing off the snow. Without a word, I took the shovel from her and continued where she left off, while she stepped back and let me work, brushing snow from her mittens. When I finished, we stood there for a moment, breath steaming in the crisp air, looking out at the yard that had become our quiet sanctuary over the months. She told me she was thinking of planting new flowers come spring, Something bright, maybe. Marigolds or tulips. I could picture it already, her in gardening gloves, dirt on her jeans. That focused frown she always wore when she was lost in a task. The image settled in my mind like a memory that hadn't happened yet but already felt familiar. We went inside after that, shedding coats and scarves, and sat by the window with coffee, warming our hands. She talked about wanting to repaint the hallway and maybe rearrange her bedroom furniture, saying it was time for a change. Not because she needed it, but because she wanted it. That distinction, that shift from necessity to desire, told me more about her healing than any conversation ever could. The deeper we moved into winter, the more we began to talk about the future, not in sweeping, definitive terms, but in quiet what-ifs and gentle maybes. She asked once if I'd ever considered leaving the city altogether. Maybe buying a little house in the countryside where things moved slower and nights were quieter. I admitted that I had many times, but never with someone else in mind. She smiled at that, a soft upward curve of the lips that carried years of understanding behind it. It wasn't a proposal or a plan, it was a possibility spoken aloud. A fragile thread we could follow or let drift, depending on where life carried us. One afternoon, as she sorted through a stack of old letters she'd written to herself during the hardest parts of her grieving, she asked if I wanted to read one. I did, carefully, holding the paper like it might tear from the weight of memory. The letter wasn't poetic or polished. It was raw, unfiltered, a stream of thoughts scribbled on a tear-stained page. She had written about the ache of waking up alone, the guilt of laughing when she thought she shouldn't, the fear of forgetting him, and the even deeper fear of one day loving someone else. Reading it felt like stepping into a version of her I had never met, a version that had nearly folded under sorrow, but chose to stand anyway. When I finished, I didn't offer words of comfort. I just held the paper a moment longer, then folded it gently and returned it to her hands. A silent act of reverence, despite the heaviness those moments sometimes brought. There was lightness too, more than I ever expected when I first knocked on her door months ago. We laughed often now, not out of politeness or tension, but from the kind of joy that lives in shared glances and inside jokes. She had this habit of making pancakes on Sundays, always burning the first one no matter how careful she tried to be. And she'd curse under her breath before flipping it with theatrical frustration. I started calling the first one the sacrificial pancake. Every Sunday, we'd laugh as she tossed it in the trash and moved on to the next batch. These weren't big moments, but they stacked up like bricks, slowly constructing a life. She began taking more photos again, using an old Polaroid camera she'd found in her closet. At first, she took pictures of flowers or books or the weathered wood of her porch railings. But then she started turning the lens toward us. A picture of our hands holding coffee mugs. A blurry snapshot of us laughing, mid-conversation. A photo of me asleep on her couch, blanket half fallen onto the floor. She said it wasn't about capturing perfect images, it was about remembering that she had lived these moments, that she had loved them, that she had survived long enough to make new memories that didn't have to compete with the old ones. And through all of it, I found myself changing in quiet ways too. Not just in how I spent my days, but in how I thought about connection, about purpose, about what it really means to be there for someone. She taught me that presence isn't always about saying the right thing. Sometimes it's just sitting beside someone while they figure it out for themselves. Sometimes it's knowing when to speak and when to simply listen. And sometimes it's about staying not because you have to, but because you want to. Had arrived at her doorstep all those months ago with a toolbox and a task, expecting to leave within the hour. But the thing about unexpected moments is that they often carry more weight than the ones you plan for. You can't schedule growth. You can't timetable healing. You just have to be willing to show up, again and again, through the mess and the stillness and the in-between. And somehow, in showing up for her, I had begun to show up for myself in ways I hadn't in years. That driveway had brought me to her once, but it was everything after the shared silence, the broken pieces, the laughter, the notes, the ordinary Thursdays that made me stay. The final snow of winter came late that year, thick and deliberate, blanketing everything in a silence that felt almost ceremonial. I arrived that morning with no specific task, to complete no repairs. No fixes, just a quiet understanding that I would be there, because being there had become part of who I was. Her house looked peaceful under the weight of the snow, a soft, white crown resting on the roof, the porch railings outlined in cold lace. She met me at the door wearing that familiar knit sweater and wool socks, her hair tied loosely, eyes still sleepy. Without a word, she led me to the kitchen, where the scent of cinnamon and bread filled the air. She had made French toast, the kind that soaked overnight and turned golden in the pan, and we ate in contented silence while the snow tapped gently against the windows. There was something different in the air, not tension, not uncertainty, but something full and settled, like the final note of a song lingering in the room before the silence returns. She looked at me then, with eyes that held both gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. And in that moment, I understood we had reached a new chapter. Not an ending, but a quiet arrival. We had both come a long way through grief, through healing, through the fragile beginnings of something real, and now we stood here, no longer wondering if we belonged in each other's lives, just did. Later that afternoon, we sat by the fireplace as the snow continued to fall, the flames casting slow shadows on the living room walls. She pulled out an old photo album, one I hadn't seen before, and opened it gently on her lap. The pages were worn, the corners soft, filled with pictures that spanned years of living, birthdays, camping trips, family dinners, smiles frozen in time. She told me stories as we flipped through them, her fingers brushing each image with the care of someone preserving something sacred. When she came to the last page, there was a blank space, empty, except for a sticky note that read, "To be continued." She paused there for a long time, fingers resting just beside the margin. And then, without looking up, she said she was ready to start filling it again. I didn't respond with words. I simply placed my hand over hers, grounding us both in the shared stillness of that promise. It was never about erasing the past. It was about allowing the present to live beside it, neither one overshadowing the other, both holding space in the same heartbeat. We didn't take a photo that day, but it's one I will always remember. The fireplace. The snow, the smell of wood smoke and cinnamon, and the soft sound of two lives unfolding beside each other, gently, like a story still being written. That night, she asked me to stay. Not for dinner, not for a movie, but for the night. Wasn't spoken like a question or a request, but like a truth finally finding its voice. I nodded once and followed her down the hallway that I had walked so many times before. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't a visitor. It was someone who had been invited into the quietest corners of her world, who had seen her laugh and cry and rebuild herself piece by piece. Her bedroom was dimly lit, the sheets freshly washed, a book resting on the nightstand. We lay there in the silence, two people breathing the same rhythm, not needing to fill the space with words. Her hand found mine beneath the blanket, and I held it not tightly, but with the ease of someone who knew they had nowhere else to be. The wind moved through the trees outside, and the world spun on, unaware of the small, infinite moment happening. Within those walls, I didn't sleep right away. I lay there for a long while, listening to the rise and fall of her breath, memorizing the sound, the weight, the presence of someone who had become home. And as I drifted off to sleep, it occurred to me that goodbyes aren't always dramatic. Sometimes the real goodbye is to the life you lived before finding someone who finally made you want to stay. In the weeks that followed, life didn't change overnight. Dishes still needed washing. The furnace still clanked when the temperature dropped too low. She still misplaced her reading glasses and burned the toast every Sunday. But something had shifted. There was laughter in the ordinary now, a shared ease in every task, a rhythm that made even the smallest rituals feel sacred. She submitted another essay, this one about love after laws, and it was accepted almost immediately. I read the final draft before she sent it in, and in her words, I saw our story mirrored back at me. Not with names or dates, but with the emotional fingerprint of everything we had walked through together. She wrote about second chances and how healing doesn't always come in thunderclaps. It often arrives like a whisper, like the gentle sound of someone knocking on your door with no intention of leaving. That piece was read by thousands. She was invited to speak on a podcast, then a local panel. And through it all, she stayed grounded, never forgetting where the journey began, on a driveway. In the cold, with a car that wouldn't start, and a stranger who showed up with more than a wrench. And now, as I sit here on this quiet evening, months after that snowy day, I can feel it's still the first flicker of connection, the soft unfolding of something beautiful. There's a photograph. On her fridge now, one she took of us last month on a trip to the lake. We're sitting on a blanket, her hand on mine, both of us laughing at something neither of us can now recall. It's not a perfect picture. Eyes are half closed and her hair is a mess from the wind, but it's us. Unfiltered, unposed, real. That's what this has been from the beginning, two people finding their way back to something honest. And though I can't predict the future, I know this. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Not as strangers crossing paths, not as broken people searching for rescue, but as two souls who chose to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. That car battery may have brought me to her door, but love patient, imperfect, and deeply. Human is what made me stay. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.